North Korea's leader Kim Jong-Un has arrived in Russia to meet with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. US officials suggest a possible deal for North Korea to supply Russia with weaponry for the Ukraine war will dominate their talks. Joining us live now is Professor Peter Dean. He is the Foreign Policy and Defence Director at the United States Study Centre. Peter, good to see you. Appreciate your time as always. You'd love to be a fly on the wall for this meeting, wouldn't you? One can only imagine what kind of small talk those two men would be making before getting down to business. What outcome are you expecting to see?
Look, I think this is really focused, as you said in your introduction, on an arms deal. So we know Russia is caught in a long, protracted war of their own making in Ukraine. Putin thought it was going to be a 3-day war and he was going to secure control over Ukraine, but his illegal invasion of Ukraine has not gone anywhere near the way he thought, and it's turned into a protracted campaign. And what we're seeing basically now is the limitations on the Russian economy, the sanctions that are putting pressure on, but also his limited levels of his defence industrial base. So he's firing off, by all reports, more ammunition than what he can produce. So I think by the sounds of it, and the analysis and material that's been coming out about this meeting, it would most likely be built around 122mm and other artillery ammunition, possibly in exchange for advanced weapon systems or technology from Russia to North Korea to support their ever-expanding military, particularly around their ballistic missile tests, submarines and other such technology, which North Korea are desperate to get their hands on as they continue to breach international sanctions and restrictions on their growing nuclear program.
We just saw some pictures earlier of that train that is carrying Kim Jong-Un into Russia. It's a pretty unique train, isn't it? It's going very slowly, and there's good reason for that.
Yeah, so it's rumoured that it only goes at about 50 kilometres an hour because it's so heavily armoured and because there's so many heavily armoured carriages that are part of that particular train. So it's moving very slowly. It's predicted it takes a whole day to do the journey. And this goes back to also his father, who much preferred train travel than he did air travel. And of course, we know North Korea is nicknamed the Hermit Kingdom in many in the international sphere. It's not a country that has a lot of international engagement. This is the first of the North Korea's leaders' trips outside of North Korea since the pandemic. And in fact, the visits of some Russian military officers were the first into North Korea since the pandemic, given they had such a hard shutdown of their borders. So you can see the type of driving factor here. There's more business being done by North Korea. And of course, both Russia and China have been protective of North Korea in the United Nations by their role in the Security Council and limiting further attempts by the rest of the international community to put further sanctions on North Korea because of its nuclear weapons program. So the sort of convergence around these states that are, somewhat pariahs in the international community because of their illegal and immoral acts, the invasion of Ukraine, the breaching their sovereignty, the ongoing weapons testing and the breaching of nuclear non-proliferation requirements through the United Nations and the global community by North Korea, is driving these two countries closer together. And what we're talking about here is mutual arms deals, and potentially also, we know for North Korea, as its economy struggles so much, access to greater business ties with Russia would be on the table, I'm sure, as well.
Peter, I did want to ask you also about the Australian-Philippines strategic partnership a bit closer to home. Australia and the Philippines, I see, have agreed to joint patrols in the South China Sea. What's actually led to that? What sort of Chinese incursions have we seen the Philippines having to manage in recent times?
Well, we've seen this as a long ongoing issue between the Philippines and China. The Philippines took this to the international court. It was ruled that the Chinese had absolutely no legal basis for any of their claims. And if you look at people who've done a lot of detailed work on this in terms of looking at the history behind it, you can see that the claims that China are putting forward are baseless, relatively speaking. We've seen China also act progressively. They've had their 9-dash line, which is now being replaced with a 10-dash line, where they're using basically maps as a form of appropriation of other states' territories and sovereign rights. And we've seen a real escalation in recent weeks over the way that, as we can see the vision here, that the Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese maritime militia vessels have basically been impeding the Filipinos legitimate right to their sovereign territory under international law. This is highly aggressive behaviour from the Chinese, and it's an attempt to dissuade the Philippines from basically exerting their sovereignty. So our Prime Minister's visit there is very much in line with this. If you look at the recent strategy documents that the government's released, the Defence Strategic Review and other statements they've made, ensuring the protection of sovereignty of Australia and other states around the region is a key part of Australia's plank. That is to be a platform that is to be done through allies and partners that we work with very closely. And of course, the Philippines is of growing importance. It's a treaty ally with the United States. And under the new Marcos regime, we've seen a definite shift and move from the Filipino government, supported more broadly by Filipino public opinion, about exerting their sovereign rights a lot more in the South China Sea, but also aligning themselves much more closely with the United States, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the other states of Southeast Asia in protecting their rights and protecting their sovereignty.
Professor Peter Dean, always appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.